Danger doesn't just strike in haunted houses, it hides in places you trust. At camp, a prank turns into a stranger calling your name. In the woods, a camper wakes to eyes outside his tent. On the road, a detour becomes a trap. Safety vanishes, and something is already waiting. The wrong number. In 2010, David and his best friend Keith were spending 2 weeks at a summer camp called Camp Ernst. The place was exactly what you'd imagine a summer camp to be, straight out of a horror movie. There were 2 large cabins, one for the boys and one for the girls, a main lodge for meals and activities, and a bunch of other smaller buildings scattered around a clearing surrounded by deep woods. David and Keith were 14, and like most kids their age, they were more interested in their video games than in sleeping. After the counselors called lights out, they'd both pull out their Nintendo DS and play with the screen brightness turned all the way down. This was a normal routine for them, a little act of rebellion against the camp rules. One night, the 2 of them were deep into a game when they heard something that made them freeze. It was the front door to the boys' cabin creaking open. They immediately tossed their DSs under their pillows and squeezed their eyes shut, pretending to be asleep. They both held their breath, listening. The sound of soft footsteps echoed in the silent, dark room. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, and they seemed to be getting closer. David's heart hammered against his ribs. He felt the footsteps stop right beside his bed. The air shifted, and for a terrifying moment, he could feel a presence looming over him. He felt the light, almost imperceptible sensation of someone breathing on the back of his neck. The feeling was so unnatural and so close that he felt a wave of cold dread wash over him. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps moved away. They passed Keith's bed, walked back down the aisle, and the door to the cabin quietly clicked shut. David opened his eyes and looked over at Keith, who was already staring at him, his face pale in the faint moonlight. They both silently pulled their DSs back out from under their pillows, their games completely forgotten. They were still trying to process what had just happened when David's phone vibrated. He pulled it out and saw he had a new text message. The number was unfamiliar. The message was simple but chilling. "Why are you 2 still up?" David's blood ran cold. The counselors had given them a list of emergency numbers, and this wasn't on it. David texted back, "Who is this?" but got no response. He showed Keith the message, and they were both completely freaked out. They assumed it had to be a counselor, maybe one who had seen them playing. Still, the text was incredibly unsettling. They decided to be a little more careful, turning their screen brightness down even further. But just a few minutes later, they heard another sound. This time, it was the back door of the cabin opening. Again, they shoved their DSs under their pillows and pretended to be asleep. David listened for footsteps, but heard nothing. He just lay there in the dark, his mind racing. Then, his phone vibrated again. Another text from the same unknown number. This time, it read, "It's Counselor Tony. Come outside to the back of the cabin. I have something to tell you." Keith, who was a few feet away, saw the glow from the screen and whispered, "That's not right. That's way too weird." David felt the same way. Counselor Tony was a real person, but this message just felt wrong. He knew it was a bad idea, but a strange curiosity mixed with a primal need to know who was out there took hold. He carefully slid out of bed and crept down the aisle towards the back of the cabin, with Keith silently shaking his head from his bunk. As he got closer to the back door, which was just a screen door, he saw something in his peripheral vision that made him stop dead. There was a little alcove, a small indentation in the wall near the back door. Peeking out from this shadowed space, he could see someone hiding. He took another step closer, his eyes adjusting to the darkness. That's when he realized it wasn't Counselor Tony. The man hiding in the shadows was old, with a creepy, gaunt face and a look in his eyes that was nothing but sinister. He was about David's height, and he was just standing there, completely still, watching him. A wave of pure, unadulterated terror washed over David. He turned and ran back to his bed screaming, "Help!" at the top of his lungs, waking up the entire cabin. The sound of the back door slamming shut echoed through the chaos. A few moments later, a real counselor, a guy named Chris, came rushing in through the front. David, still shaking, explained everything he had just seen. The counselors quickly did a head count and then went around the perimeter of the cabin searching the woods with flashlights. But it was no use. The place was too big and the forest was too thick. They never found anyone. The next morning, the camp staff and counselors were completely shaken. They kept a much closer eye on everyone, and no more strange incidents happened. But to this day, David can't shake the memory of that encounter. The question that still haunts him is the same one that haunted him that night. How did that man get his phone number? How did he know who he was? And what would have happened if David had actually gone outside? It's a horrifying thought that he still can't get out of his head. The other camper. James has a tradition with his family. Every year in August, they would go on a camping trip to mark the end of summer. As he got older, the tradition continued, but a busy adult life meant he often had to go alone. His girlfriend hated camping, and his brother and dad weren't always available. He had gotten used to the solitude, actually preferring the peace and quiet of the wilderness over crowded campgrounds. Last August, James wanted a truly remote experience. He used Google Maps to find an isolated clearing far from any official campgrounds, roads, or hiking trails. He figured he'd have complete privacy, just him and the wilderness. After downloading the maps for offline use, he hiked in for about 2 hours, carrying all his gear, until he found the perfect spot. It was a secluded flat area surrounded by thick pine trees with a small clearing where he could pitch his tent and see the stars. The first night was exactly what he'd hoped for. Quiet, serene, and completely uneventful. He made a small fire, cooked some food, and just enjoyed the peace. The next day, he decided to hike to a nearby river he'd spotted on his map. He spent the entire day there trying to catch a fish for dinner. He got lucky and caught a decent-sized trout, feeling proud and accomplished. He packed up his gear and started heading back to his campsite. But James had completely misjudged the time. By the time he started his hike back, the sun was already setting, and within 20 minutes it was pitch black. He was moving slowly, his headlamp providing only a small circle of light on the unfamiliar forest floor. Suddenly, he saw a faint light in the distance. It was swaying back and forth in a rhythmic pattern like someone else was walking with a lantern. At first, James felt a sense of relief. Maybe it was another lost camper. He decided to call out, yelling a friendly, "Hello!" and asking if they were camping nearby. The light stopped swaying instantly. It sat perfectly still for a few seconds, which James thought was odd, and then it just shut off completely. James stood there, staring into the darkness where the light had just been. Then he heard it, the sound of someone violently crashing through the underbrush, running at full speed. But they weren't running toward or away from him. They were running to the side, perpendicular to his position. His heart began to pound. The whole thing was deeply unsettling. He couldn't rationalize the person's actions. Why would they run away so violently? Even if he'd startled them, wouldn't they have said something back, or at least walked away slowly? He tried to calm himself on the hike back to his campsite, telling himself he'd just scared a lone hiker, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. He made it back to his tent, but his appetite was gone. He was too unnerved to even start a fire to cook his fish. He just ate some of his packed food and crawled into his tent trying to read a book before calling it an early night. He was a heavy sleeper, especially after a long day of hiking. So when he suddenly woke up in the middle of the night, he knew something was off. He lay there listening, but all he heard were the normal sounds of the forest. He finally decided he needed to step outside to relieve himself. He unzipped his tent, and in the bright moonlight, he saw a silhouette standing no more than 15 feet away. It was a person, completely motionless, just staring at his tent. James froze. His mind was racing. The figure had to have heard him unzip the tent. He was completely exposed. He didn't know what to do. The The silence was deafening, and he felt a cold wave of terror as he realized he was just moments away from being attacked. His survival instinct finally kicked in. He grabbed the switchblade he always kept by the entrance of his tent and yelled, "Who's there?" The moment the words left his mouth, the figure started sprinting directly toward him, letting out a shriek that was so shrill and unnatural it didn't even sound human. The person, who James could now tell was a man, slammed into him. They fell to the ground, rolling around as the man started clawing at James's face like an animal. He wasn't punching. He was literally trying to tear him to shreds with his bare hands. James managed to get his switchblade between them and sliced at the man's hand. The cut, even though it wasn't clean, was enough. The man shrieked again and immediately scrambled off of him, crashing through the woods once more. This time, James could hear him screaming or laughing, he couldn't tell which, as he disappeared into the darkness. James lay there for what felt like an eternity, his face stinging from the scratches and his hands shaking uncontrollably. He could feel blood on his face, but he didn't know if it was his or the man's. He considered hiking back to his car, but navigating the pitch-black woods seemed even more dangerous than staying put. He spent the rest of the night in his tent, holding the knife, listening to every sound, expecting the man to come back at any moment. The second the sun rose, James packed up his gear and hiked back to his car as fast as he could. He thought about calling the police, but decided against it. What would he even say? He was camping illegally in the middle of nowhere. They'd probably just tell him he got what he deserved. The whole drive home, he couldn't stop thinking about how close he'd come to something truly terrible. The man wasn't a camper, and he wasn't a normal person. He had tracked James down in the darkness and attacked him without a word. And that scream, it still makes James's skin crawl just thinking about it. He hasn't been solo camping since, and he isn't sure he ever will again. The New Mexico Labyrinth. What happened took place 3 years ago, when Lena was 19. Her older brother Luke had just graduated from college in California, and the two of them were driving cross-country back home to New Jersey. Since he had been living out there for 4 years, he had accumulated a whole apartment's worth of stuff, furniture, electronics, books, everything, and there was no way he could fly back with all of it. But that wasn't the main reason they were making the drive. For Lena, a cross-country road trip felt like the perfect summer adventure. They could have taken the direct route through Nevada and Colorado, but Luke wanted to see more of the country he had studied, and Lena had never visited places like Zion or the Grand Canyon either, so they decided to take the scenic route along the southern edge. Luke insisted on renting a U-Haul instead of just shipping everything or selling it and starting fresh back home. Lena suspected he was also trying to save money wherever possible, like a typical fresh college graduate. The U-Haul wasn't huge, but it was big enough that Lena felt like they were driving a small moving truck across the country. Before they left, both their parents and nearly every travel forum had given the same warning. Be careful in New Mexico. It wasn't that the entire state was dangerous, but there were stories about scams targeting travelers, along with crime in some of the smaller towns and generally unsettling situations in the more remote desert areas. Their father specifically told them not to stop there unless absolutely necessary, and if they did, to stick to major gas stations and get back on the highway as quickly as possible. Luke and Lena agreed they would drive straight through New Mexico without stopping. They would fill up in Arizona, cross the state as quickly as they could, and stop again once they hit Texas. It seemed like a reasonable plan. The first part of the trip was everything they hoped it would be. Zion was incredible, and the Grand Canyon was just as breathtaking as Lena had imagined. Driving through Arizona was beautiful in a way she hadn't expected, but somewhere in the remote stretch of New Mexico, their plan began to unravel. The U-Haul was getting worse gas mileage than Luke had anticipated, and the gauge was dropping faster than they had calculated. In hindsight, it was naive to assume they could make it through the entire state without stopping. They began searching for the next gas station along the highway, but according to their GPS, it was still about 40 miles away. With the gauge already below a quarter tank, Luke grew nervous about whether they would make it. He pulled over to check the map, and that was when they realized they didn't really have a choice. There was a small town about 10 miles ahead that appeared on the GPS as having a gas station. It wasn't ideal, but it was better than risking running out of gas in the middle of the desert. The town was tiny, probably no more than a few hundred people, if that. It had the odd stillness that some small desert towns seem to carry, as if everyone stayed inside, hiding from the heat, even though the day itself wasn't particularly hot. There were a few rundown buildings, a short main street, and not much else. Luke and Lena didn't see any other travelers or cars passing through, which felt strange since they were still relatively close to a major highway. The gas station was one of those generic places with a couple of pumps and a small convenience store attached. As Luke filled up the tank, Lena noticed the way a few locals looked at them. The stares weren't openly hostile, but they lingered just long enough to make her uneasy. One man leaning against the convenience store with a cigarette kept catching her eye, and she had to force herself not to look at him. She tried to convince herself it was simply because they stood out two young outsiders in a U-Haul with California plates, but the tension still sat heavy in her chest. Once Luke finished fueling, they tried to navigate their way back to the highway. From certain intersections, they could clearly see the road they needed, but every street they turned down led them away from it. Sometimes, the road would curve unexpectedly. Sometimes, it would dead end. And sometimes, it veered in a direction that made no sense at all. Their GPS wasn't much help. It routed them towards streets that didn't exist anymore, and the poor cell signal meant the map flickered between connection and nothingness. With each attempt, they ended up circling the same few blocks, their frustration and unease mounting. Lena gripped the door handle, her anxiety growing stronger with every turn. Luke tried to keep his composure, but she could see the tension in his jaw. The strange layout of the town felt deliberate, almost as if the roads were designed to confuse them. She couldn't explain why, but the sensation unsettled her more deeply than she wanted to admit. After another 20 minutes of going in circles, Luke made a decision. He would drive back to the gas station and ask for directions in person. Lena protested, begging him not to go inside. Her unease had grown into something close to dread, and she wanted nothing more than to leave the town immediately. But Luke snapped at her in frustration, saying they were trapped in the one place they had promised not to linger. She saw the fear in his expression, even as he tried to stay in control. Resigned, she kept quiet as he parked at the station once more. Luke stepped inside while Lena waited in the van. She watched the front door anxiously, her heart pounding, every second stretching longer than the last. When he finally emerged, his expression was troubled. Sliding into the driver's seat, he explained that the clerk had given him directions, but they seemed unnecessarily complicated. According to the man, they needed to drive 17 miles in the opposite direction of the highway, through a series of desert backroads, before eventually looping back to an on-ramp. Lena stared at Luke as though he had lost his mind. The idea of driving 17 miles in the wrong direction when they could still see the highway from town seemed absurd. She asked what the clerk had been like. Luke admitted the man seemed friendly enough on the surface, but there had been something unsettling about how confidently he delivered the directions. It was as if he wanted to convince Luke that this convoluted route was the only possible way forward. Luke also mentioned that the clerk had pressed him with unnecessary questions where they were headed, how long they had been traveling, even whether they were carrying much. The exchange left him uneasy, and Lena could see the doubt written across his face. Before she could say anything, Luke shook his head firmly. He told her he didn't trust the directions at all and that they needed to leave the town immediately. His voice was sharp, filled with urgency. Without waiting for her reply, he started the engine and pulled away from the gas station. Lena didn't argue. A few blocks later, he pulled onto a quiet side street and stopped. He sat gripping the steering wheel, his jaw tight, as though weighing their dwindling options. The GPS still refused to cooperate, flashing in and out of signal, and Lena felt panic clawing its way up her throat. Her breaths came quicker, shallow and uneven. She pressed her palms against her knees, trying to steady herself, but the air inside the van felt heavy, almost suffocating. Then, without warning, a dusty pickup truck slowed to a stop beside them. The sound of gravel crunching under its tires made Lena's chest tighten. She turned to see the driver's window roll down. A middle-aged man with sun-worn skin leaned out, his expression unreadable. He asked if they were broken down or lost. His voice was casual, but Lena felt a jolt of fear shoot through her. Luke didn't respond right away. He watched the man in silence for several long seconds, clearly trying to measure whether he posed a threat. Lena sat frozen in the passenger seat, forcing herself to breathe steadily, even as her heart hammered in her chest. Finally, Luke said they were just trying to reach the highway. He repeated the route the clerk at the gas station had described, his tone careful, almost testing the man's reaction. The driver's demeanor changed instantly. His voice grew serious, even sharp, as he told them they should absolutely not take that route. He said it would lead them toward a desolate stretch of desert notorious for drug running, and that strangers who wandered out there rarely came back without trouble. Lena felt her stomach turn cold. The man leaned a little closer out the window, adding that it was practically a miracle they hadn't been robbed already. Two young people in a U-Haul with out-of-state plates, circling a small desert town, they couldn't have looked more vulnerable. Before Luke or Lena could respond, the man gave them quick, clear alternate directions. Then, without waiting for thanks, he rolled up his window and drove off, leaving behind only a trail of dust. For a moment, the van was silent. Luke's hands tightened around the steering wheel before he muttered that they were following the new directions. Lena simply nodded, too shaken to speak. Luke gripped the wheel, his expression set with determination. Without another word, he guided the van out of the side street and toward the outskirts of town, following the directions the stranger had given them. Lena sat quietly beside him, her hands resting tensely on her lap. Neither of them spoke. The silence felt heavy, as if one wrong sound might shatter the fragile sense of safety the man's warning had provided. About a mile outside of town, they spotted the turnoff. It was nothing more than a gravel road branching off the main route, nearly hidden by weeds and scrub. If the man hadn't mentioned it, they would have driven right past. Luke slowed, his eyes narrowing, then steered the U-Haul onto it. The van rumbled over the uneven ground as they left the last signs of the town behind. The road was long, winding, and utterly desolate. Dust clung to the air in a thin veil, stirred by the movement of the van. Lena watched the barren desert stretch endlessly on either side, her stomach still knotted with unease. It felt like they were driving deeper into nowhere, but Luke pressed on, following the stranger's instructions step by step. After several tense minutes, the gravel road curved unexpectedly. Ahead, they saw the shape of an on-ramp merging with the highway. Relief washed over Lena like a tide. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding, and Luke exhaled too, his grip on the wheel loosening just slightly. They had made it back. The van rolled onto the highway, the sound of tires humming steadily against asphalt. Neither of them spoke for a while, both still processing the strangeness of what had just happened. The town receded behind them, swallowed by distance and desert heat. Eventually, Luke broke the silence. He admitted he didn't want to think too much about what might have happened if they had followed the clerk's directions. Lena nodded, but her mind kept circling back to the same chilling thought. What if the stranger in the pickup hadn't appeared at all? The rest of the drive passed without incident. Hours later, as the sun dipped low on the horizon and the tension finally began to ease, they spoke of the experience more lightly, almost as if trying to convince themselves it had been nothing more than a bizarre detour. But deep down, Lena knew it had been more than that. There had been something profoundly wrong about that town, about the way the road seemed to twist against them, about the clerk's pressing questions and confident lies. Back home, the story became one of those tales their family asked them to retell at gatherings. Luke would recount the details with a nervous laugh, and Lena would fill in the parts he forgot. On the surface, it had become a funny family anecdote, the kind you shake your head at years later. Yet for Lena, the memory carried a weight she couldn't shrug off. She remembered the stillness of that town, the suffocating dread in her chest, the feeling of being trapped just out of reach of safety. It was something she never wanted to experience again. Luke once described the sensation as a kind of breathless limbo, where you're not quite suffocating, but you can feel it coming. Lena thought that was exactly right. And even years later, when she thought back on that stretch of road in New Mexico, she could feel it lingering at the edges of her memory. The oppressive air, the tightening in her chest, and the unshakable certainty that they had come dangerously close to something they were never meant to see.